Hello and welcome. Welcome again to the Paper Knives Poetry Podcast interview edition. I'm here with Jessie Lynn McMains. Jessie was the 2016-2017 Poet Laureate for Racine, Wisconsin, the winner of the 2019 Hal Prize for Poetry, and July through December, Racine Writer in Residence. They are the author of several books and chapbooks, most recently Left of the Dial, from Scumbag Press in 2022, and Wisconsin Death Trip, which I believe came out from Bone and Ink. Their spoken word album, Self-Portrait with Ghosts and Trains, was released by Hello America in July 2021. They're also a visual artist, zine maker, and editor of Bone and Ink Press, who currently reside in Racine, Wisconsin, with their partner and children. I should note here that I first came into contact with Jessie. I want to say it was back in 2014 that I first heard you read, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on the date, the time, but it was at a poetentry event that Kevin Brown had put together, and I think he ran like maybe 2 or 3 of those down on Main Street. There was some big event that was going on too. It wasn't like maybe it was Party on the Pavement. But
yeah, no, it wasn't poetentry. I think that the venue where it was where they used to have poetentry, because I don't think I ever went. It would have been 2015. And
maybe it was the 100,000 Poets for Change.
Yeah, that's exact. And it was also Party on the Pavement that night. I remember that.
Oh.
Because it was after I already knew I was going to be the next Poet Laureate, but we weren't announcing yet, so it was just like, yeah, that was my first, like, well, not my first local reading, but my first since I'd moved back, I guess.
Do we both have tea here? Is this like, are we having tea time?
Yep, I'm having tea.
Nice. Wonderful.
What kind?
I am drinking Yogi Tea's Elderberry Lemon Balm variety. And you?
I have Republic of Tea's Decaf Ginger Peach.
Oh, the Ginger Peach. Nice. Mm-hmm. I had thought about a ginger mango, but opted instead for this one, which has massive quantities of ashwagandha, which I need.
Yeah, I take those. I take those supplements, so I get that.
So, Jessie, would you mind starting things off with a rendition of a poem for us?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
This poem actually appears. It's the first poem in Wisconsin Death Trip, which, yes, I did name this after the Michael Lacey book of the same name. Like, some people, I got someone asking me if it was like, said that I was ripping him off, and I'm like, well, no, I make it very, like, there's, in the acknowledgments, like, I mentioned that was, inspired by like, the original book, not that.
Would you consider it an homage?
Not like.
Yeah.
But this poem is actually one of my older ones that I still perform, and I'm starting with this because it's although that wasn't its intent when I wrote it, it ended up being something of an ars poetica. It's called You Deplete Me. Let go of the things that are hurting you. Get free. Oh, sorry. I'm going to go back on myself. I'll start over in a sec. Content warnings. This is probably the only poem I'm sharing today that actually requires one. There's mentions of like drugs and alcohol and cigarettes, things like that. There's nothing like explicit. I mean, it mentions those things. There's nothing graphic, I guess, is what I would say. But just thought I'd start that one with a content warning. Okay. You deplete me. Let go of the things that are hurting you. Get free. What if it's impossible to let go? Impossible to leave? You can't imagine your life without these things. You've outgrown habits, relationships, cities, scenes. Holding on is a slow death, a marimba and wheeze in your chest. But cutting ties is a gutting, is a severing of your arteries. Break yourself of longing for the things you shouldn't want. Try subverting the yearning. Try aversion therapy. Think of what you ache for as roadkill, a dead raccoon on the hot blacktop. Sometimes you want things because they're all you've got. It's not like you didn't realize the roses were stinging nettle and the beer tasted like piss. Not like you didn't smell the rot. A person, place, or thing is toxic if it takes more than it gives. But how do you quantify deplete versus provide? Can what's given outweigh what's taken? Can you measure it with a list? The drugs destroy your body. The drugs made you feel like God lived in your blood. This friend doesn't listen and always needs a ride. This friend was your us versus them partner in crime. The power plant and its cigarette smokestacks puff carcinogens into the sky. You hid in the wild, weedy places nearby. You wished on the steam clouds and were given a dream of graffiti and garbage. The trains carry coal stripped from blue mountains back east. You have measured your restless life with their sound. You have ridden in a gondola and watched the stars glimmer way up above in the coal black. How do you gauge drain versus fill? Would you trade your past and its litany of longings for a future blank as slate? Make another list of everything you'll miss and burn it like cancer stick smokestacks. Goodbye, old friends. Goodbye, drugs. I've outgrown you. Goodbye, lonesome whistle in the night. Goodbye, factory walls and rail yards. Goodbye, hidden places. The only thing I'm keeping is this ache.
I know we had talked about having some other questions, but I'm compelled to kind of meditate on that poem a little bit and ask you some questions about it, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, what? I mean, there was a lot of language that I heard that. So I've been sober since 2011, and there was a lot of language that I heard, phrases like letting go, that reminded me a lot of like recovery language. And then there's like this reference to like letting go of the drugs that are not serving the narrator's perspective. I'm kind of curious, because that seems like a predominant theme. How do you experience? More of a yes or no question, which I feel bad about asking, but do you in any way experience writing or poetry as an addiction? Because it seemed like there was this letting go, right? And then like the right, like all I'm going to have is this ache. And for me, at least, like writing comes out of a place of aching, right? This sort of like void that's like left there and unfilled by anything else. I'm kind of curious how would you explicate those concepts that are at work in this particular poem?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely came out of well, I'm not sober. Like, I mean, I haven't like, I mean, the poem came out of a time though when I was trying to like significantly cut way back on all that stuff. I mean, I quit doing a lot of like, like heavy drugs and stuff,
Sure.
like of drugs. It wasn't like, and I drink, very occasionally compared to what it used to be.
Yeah, sure,
and,
sure.
Have tried to quit smoking various times, which, is its own struggle.
Yeah,
but,
for sure.
So that was written at a time when I was sort of trying to either quit things or at least like stop trying to fill the void with unhealthy things, whether it was, friends who weren't good for me or substances or anything like that. And, but also like the reason I call it an Ars Poetica was, I mean, I guess, sorry, I'm all over the place. You asked if...
No, I'm kind of all over the place too, so it's fine. And I also want to say, I'm not, when I mentioned my own sobriety, I only mentioned that from the context of like why I'm picking up on a theme.
Oh yeah.
No, I mean,
I didn't feel any judgment. I was just saying that like I mean, that's why that kind of language is in there, because I was trying to sort of like, you know,
let go, yeah,
let go and at least like reduce the harm in my life in terms of, you know, using things either at all or at least using them in an unhealthy, addictive way, you know, if possible. But what you would ask if I think of like writing as a kind of addiction, and I mean, I guess it can definitely fill, you know, a place that that other things that I've tried to fill with other things, but I mean, I don't know how to not write, but to me it doesn't feel like it doesn't feel the same as an addiction. I don't know how to explain it. I'll have to think more about that.
It's not like I want to say not a longing or a yearning, but like there's almost this sort of like when I think about addiction, of my own addictions, it's like going into it, I sort of knew it was bad for me.
Right.
So there was like it was tinged with that, whereas I would say maybe the writing is only marginally bad for me in that like it takes my time away or my inkling to like do other things that people tell me are more productive.
Right. Yeah. I guess you could say like the writing could be considered, you know, bad in the sense of like terms of taking your time away from, you know, more lucrative ventures, I guess. But it's not like literally. I mean, I guess the only way in which it's like could be literally physically destructive is if you're like not eating and not sleeping because you're writing, which has happened to me before, but still, as things go, it's not, it's not something I think like, oh, this is going to, and in fact, if I don't write for too long, I start feeling way worse, like mentally, than if so it's kind of the opposite of,
it's a healthy addiction,
in that regard, you know. But I guess where it came out of this poem was letting go, but also about, and the reason why I say it's sort of an Ars Poetica is because it sort of I have a tendency to like write a lot of stuff about those days of my life when I was, you know, doing a lot of drugs and drinking and, you know, traveling all the time and, you know, to the detriment of everything else in my life and like, you know, casual hookups with a lot of people, you know, and that was, I have a tendency to write about them a lot in ways that have had people accuse me of like romanticizing things that are bad or that I shouldn't, you know, that I should be condemning like outright. And, you know, it was the poem was sort of me like trying to let go of some things, but also taking stock of like, you know, why, like, is it okay to, I mean, like personally, do I feel like obviously no matter how you write or what you write about, someone's going to have something to say about it. So I guess I was sort of taking stock like personally, like, do I feel like it's okay for me to write about these quote unquote bad things or times in my life that were objectively not great, but write about them in a way that's, you know, where they're romanticized. So it was both.
Sure. And I think that there's a difference in, maybe, I don't know if you agree with this, but it seems to me that there's a difference between romanticizing and celebrating or elevating to the literary. Do you know what I mean? Like, to romanticize it almost seems to me to say, like, this is a good thing that we should aspire to, and whereas I think that celebrating or elevating to the literary is more like recognizing that it's a common human experience, and that by virtue of writing it down or turning it into art, it provides maybe the kind of prophecy that like Allen Ginsberg talked about, where you're taking a feeling and putting it into the artifact so that someone in the future is going to be able to look at it and kind of recognize, like, oh yeah, I've been there too. It's like, you know, I read Kerouac and like or Burroughs, and like they're certainly writing about, you know, right? Burroughs is writing about shooting up, and Kerouac's always writing about, you know, his drunken escapades. And I don't know that we need to like approve of those in order to recognize the literary value of them, right? So like the thing that I was taken by was like the way that you're using assonance and wordplay throughout that piece, in addition to the themes that you brought up. I don't know. Does that make sense?
No, it completely makes sense. I've never heard it put that way, but I guess like people, when you use any, like when you're elevating something to the literary, at least for me, when I use language that shows like sort of the beauty amidst these like hard things, I'm not trying to gloss over and say, oh, this is something we should aspire to and you know, but other people reading it are, you know, I think not a lot of people, but necessarily, but I think people don't necessarily, they can't see the nuance between, you know, elevating to, you know, putting into literature art versus romanticizing, because there, you know, there's a lot of talk about if you don't flat out condemn it, if there's not like a clear moral, you know, then you're condoning it, or encouraging it, which I mean, I don't want to read literature that's just like beating me over the head with what it's, you know, trying to, like, its meaning or moral. I feel like that's, you know, for children's literature, and actually most children's literature isn't even that, like...
Right, yeah. Dante says something in like one of the later cantos where he basically makes fun of Aesop, and he's like, what do you expect me to like write fables? Like, of course not, right? Like, I'm not going to write these children's things. I'm going to give you this kind of graphic depiction of, right, what my subject matter is. So I completely agree with you. Moralizing literature almost seems like an oxymoron. So to sort of transition, though the piece that you wrote, you know, has these autobiographical elements to it, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your journey as a writer, your evolution as a poet and writer, your evolution as an artist, and just kind of how you got started, you know, when the muses started to speak to you, and how you've seen your approach to making things develop over the course of that career.
I'm one of those, you know, annoying people who was like pretty much, you know, I enjoyed writing in school and was told I was good at it, so I just was like, okay, that's what I'm... Well, no, I mean, I actually had lots of other interests, like things I considered pursuing in life, but writing is the only one I've really stuck with, so that's, you know, that's neither here nor there. But as far as it's interesting because I went to college for writing. I started, well, actually, I went to a lot of different universities. I transferred a bunch. Initially, I was going to school for film. That was going to be my that was my thing. I wanted to be a screenwriter and director. But ended up dropping out, and then when I transferred, decided just to go for like creative writing, and actually mostly for fiction writing. That's what I studied for most of my undergrad years, and that's what I mean, I always also wrote nonfiction because I'd been publishing zines since I was 12. And I wrote poetry from, you know, a young age, but it was mostly a prose writer, both fiction and non, and I mostly, you know, mostly studied fiction as far as, like, doing that. And then I just, it was, funnily enough, it was becoming Poet Laureate of Racine that, like, made me think of myself as a poet. I mean, I always wrote poetry, and actually for like a good 2 years before that happened, I had started getting back into writing poems, like, more and more regularly. But I was one of those people that, you know, if anyone ever called me a poet, I'd be like, no. You know, I was very, like, you know, I'd say, like, I write poems sometimes, but I'm just a writer. I'm not a poet, you know. I don't know if it was shame over, like, the poet label or if it was just not feeling like I deserved it. You know, it could have been either or.
Yeah.
But I decided to apply for the Poet Laureate thing, and when it happened, I kind of was like, well, I guess I'm a poet, and since then, I still write prose, but you know, poetry is what I, like, naturally, like, that's what I mostly do now.
Sure. Had you done spoken word prior to? Because I think I remember you doing a spoken word piece at that first event that I saw you at.
Oh yeah, I
Have
did
you done a lot of
spoken
spoken
word,
word
like, I mean, starting at, like, open mics in the 90s. It was, and then I did a lot of zine readings, you know, like, so I did spoken word, but it was prose spoken word for the most part, not counting when, like, open mics when I was a teenager, and that's when I still wrote more poetry before I focused on prose for a long time.
Sure.
But I was always doing, like, spoken word kind of interspersed with other things. There was a time when I mostly played music, but oftentimes I would do sets where I'd do, like, some music and some spoken word. So even when I wasn't really writing a lot of poems, I still kept, like, a foot in the performance aspect.
Sure. I'd like to ask how you think about spoken word, prose writing, nonfiction writing, and poetry. Can you talk a little bit about how you conceptualize those things, how they're different, how they overlap for you, how you approach them as a writer when you're starting out with the development of a piece?
It's rough because oftentimes I don't know like, if what I'm writing is going to be poetry or prose, or, you know, and lately I've been writing a lot more stuff that I'm like, I don't know what to call this, because I'll write something that I think of as a poem, and other people, like, I guess kind of a prose poem sometimes, like, in the form, but other people will not even, you know, I've had some pieces that I've, like, shared online or whatever, where people are like, what a beautiful piece of prose, and I'm like, oh, that was supposed to be a poem, but it, you know, I've been writing more and more of stuff that kind of blurs the lines, and that makes it, like, really difficult to submit to places, because they're like, is it flash fiction, or a lyric essay, or a prose poem? And I'm like, I don't know.
Sure. Or is it a hybrid? Maybe
right.
It's a hybrid. Not
every place has a hybrid category, so I'm like, I don't know what to submit it as. Which one is it, you know?
Right.
And yeah, some things are more clear cut. Like, if I'm writing a review of, you know, an album or something, I know it's going to be prose. Like, but then if it starts getting in the realm of this sort of, like, you know, more weird, like,
inspired
autobiographical Lester Bangs type stuff, then, like, then sometimes I'm like, well, this might work better as a poem, because it's not a straight review anyway. It's more like a riff on how this made me feel. So yeah, that's a hard question, because I used to have more of, like, a clear, this is what, you know, this is fiction, this is nonfiction, this is poetry, this is prose, and now it's just sort of all do these things fit together? Okay. Like,
it's a piece of writing.
Yeah. Sometimes there's line breaks, sometimes there's not, you know?
Right. Judge it as you will.
Right.
So as a writer, in terms of the activities that you engage in artistically, writer, zine maker, editor, and then in addition to the actual writing, right, like sending things out, submitting them, which you just mentioned, I'm kind of curious do all of those activities feed into, and how are they fed into by being a parent who is, you know, trying to juggle all of the responsibilities of parenthood with the responsibilities that we kind of voluntarily take on as writers and editors?
Yeah, I mean, it's rough. I basically feel like I am, you know, it's hard to find that balance, for me at least, like, of doing the writing stuff and the editing stuff and the sending out submissions. Actually, I haven't, over the past 3 years, I've hardly submitted anywhere. I'm working on like a bunch of packets right now to send out, and this is going to be like, you know, I mean, the last few years I've submitted like 2, maybe 3 places a year, but this year I have like this long list, and I'm hoping to hit them all. It's hard. It's often difficult. I often feel like I'm neglecting either my parenting stuff, or I'm neglecting, you know, my writing and running the press and everything and work. I guess the main way that like parenting informs what I do is that, well, it's not that I never procrastinate, because I actually do all the time, but I procrastinate less than I used to because I don't have time to. Like, if I have an hour, you know, to myself, I'm like, okay, just gotta check things off the list and, like, you know, do whatever I can, because, you know, once the kids are back, I gotta, you know, handle that. So.
Do you find that that your kids work their way into, or that parenthood generally works its way into the content of your writing?
Occasionally. I have a couple poems to share that mention either my kids specifically or, you know, parenting in general. But I actually don't write about parenting that much. It was something or about my children. I mean, I do, but I don't tend to share that work with the world, and it's not because, I mean, obviously everything is, you know, nebulous enough that it's not like I'm worried my kids are going to see it one day and be upset, you know, because it's not like using their names or.
Mm-hmm.
But it's more just that it's difficult for me to write about parenting. It's like it's like in one sense, since it's happening to me all the time, I don't have that perspective, you know? It's like I'm just in it. That's part of it. Part of it is because I don't want to. I have a hard time, like, or at least it's difficult for me to. I don't want to come across as either like, I don't want to write like really sentimental poems about my children where it's just like, oh, I love my precious babies, you know, like that type of schmaltz. Mm-hmm. But I also don't want to go the other way and just sound like I'm just whining about, you know, like complaining about how hard it is.
Sure.
And so I think until I find a way to strike that balance between the, you know, make it, like, show the reality without being either too sentimental or too harsh, then I probably, you know, like I said, I do write about them, but just not with, like, in my public work as much.
Sure.
So.
Would you mind sharing the pieces that you'd selected for today that have to relate in some way with parenting?
Absolutely. This first one.
I should also say, if these are pieces that you'd rather keep private, please don't feel like you've got to.
Oh, no, I wrote them for like one of them I just shared at Bonk, the that I just did, and had already been out in the world before that, and the other one is newly finished, and I wrote it, with the hope of publication eventually, so.
Sure, okay.
But thank you. So this first one is untitled. I've never found a title for it. Lying on the floor of my studio, looking through the bay window, watching the late afternoon light glow the leaves of the Crimson King maple. My 2-year-old rests his head on my shoulder, says, "Mama, with our skin and hearts, could we be something else? Mama, I was something else once." Outside, the purple-red hearts of the leaves tremble in the smallest rumor of breeze.
Wow. I love the way that, the breeze almost in a breeze-like way, brings back the image of the maple and its leaves, along with the assonance that carries through from leaves to breeze, or near rhyme. That's a great piece, and the way that it moves from outside to inside to outside again has a really, I would even say, majestic kind of movement to it. Thanks for sharing that. That was great.
Oh, thank you.
And you had another one?
Yes, but did you have another question or comment?
Well, if the next one also relates to parenthood, we can stay on that theme for now.
Yeah, this one is not as specifically about my own children, but it's about parenting and childhood at the same time. And the working title right now is Not Even When the Street Lights. The air crackles, alive with smoke and sugar. Leaves crunch underfoot. The sky, too, has painted its face. Jaw whitened with a greasy smudge of moon, waxing. Cheeks scarred pink by October's last sunset. We watch our children run ahead of us into the dark, shrieking with delicious fear. Their felted and gossamer wings flapping, rubber and plastic and cardboard masks slipping down too low over their eyes. They run towards the houses of strangers, lured by synthetic gravestones, inflatable spiders, and the grinning, candlelit visages of jack-o'-lanterns carved too soon, already rubbered by decay. We watch as they enact the old rituals, the incantation, trick or treat, meant to summon bags and buckets heavy with delicious junk in crackling wrappers. Chocolate, caramel, peanut butter, false fruit. As the dark grows and the streetlights blink on, we are suddenly afraid. The bonfire smoke seems thicker, the leaf piles deeper, the branches of near-bare trees turned to skeletal fingers, reaching. The sky's moon-paint clown face suddenly sinister, leering. We pull our own jackets tighter, watch our ectoplasmic breath float from our mouths, tiny ghosts flying into the hallowed eve. Still, we hang back, shout occasional reminders for them to wait their turn, say thank you, not run too far ahead. They don't listen. They leave us and return, our tiny ghosts, little monsters, small superheroes. We want to say, wait for us. We know one day they'll leave us and not return, and we are terrified, but beneath that fear is a longing. To float from our grown bodies and back into a remembered time when we, too, were lawless and unfinished. A time when we paraded through October's final dusk in our lovely, scary, strange finery, and thought the ritual might unlock a deeper magic. Trick or treat, we'd say, and our masks and hats, robes and stockings would fuse to us, and we'd become witches and zombies, pirates and bank robbers for real, forever. And with our pockets full of nothing but candy and plastic spiders, we'd wander too far, disappear into the dark and the piles of wet, red leaves, and never return home, not even when our parents called to us, not even when the streetlights came on.
Wow. I was just kind of blown away with the imagery, the sequence of imagery, and then also noticed like the kind of genealogy of Halloween that you worked into there, and also the way that it like really touches on like how being a parent or even just watching kids transports one back to one's own childhood. Thanks for sharing that. I'm curious with both of these pieces. I'm wondering. I mean, you mentioned that the first one is like particularly about you and your child, and I can understand why the subsequent one is a little bit more general, right, in terms of the we that speaks. I'm curious how autobiographical they were in terms of the moments that inspired you to write them. Like, I'm kind of wondering, like, were these particular events that occurred that then gave you images that you started working with?
Yeah, that untitled one was the short one about me and my youngest. That was, pretty much just a description of an actual thing that happened, the thing he said, and it's funny because I'd shared that before and someone told me it wasn't believable that a 2-year-old would say that, but I was like, but he actually said that, and he was 2 at the time.
Did they have kids?
Right, I know. I was like, my kids say like the darndest things, Yeah. No, but I mean, they say stuff that sounds so like grown up and
poetic,
where you're like,
absolutely,
what?
Absolutely.
So that was just, actually just a distillation of, one specific moment. The other one started with, just being out with my kids trick-or-treating this past Halloween, and just sort of witnessing all that, and then just was like, well, that free association makes it sound really, I don't mean that, like, I didn't edit it or that I was just,
Mm-hmm.
But it was just sort of what my memories of Halloweens when I was a kid and what I was feeling watching, my kids and the other neighborhood kids. And I chose to use we instead of I because, I was sort of witnessing the other parents as well and how, they were pretty much responding to what their kids were doing the same way I was to my own. Mm-hmm. That, like, wait, don't run too far ahead, wait your turn, say thank you. Like, that's all very, pretty common, I think.
Yeah, right. Even though we know that when we were kids, we didn't, like...
Right.
We didn't listen.
And we know our kids aren't going to listen, but it's like we have to say it.
Because that's what you do, right? How, like, in terms of your writing process, how immediately in each of those experiences or after each of those experiences did you know that you were going to write about it or that it was going to become a piece that you needed to work on?
The untitled one, I knew basically right away. It was just such what he said, and also the image of the tree. Like I was like, I got to do something with this. That one actually went through. I've had a lot of different versions that are only slightly different, but somehow I think with like shorter poems, I might edit them even more because, it's like that, I have to get, I'm trying to pack like specific things in there, but just, I guess I wouldn't say I necessarily edit them more, but I'm more likely to tweak just one word or like the order of, you know, one or two words. So that one I worked on for a long time before I got something I actually, you know, am somewhat happy with. But I knew right away that I wanted to do something.
Right.
The other one, actually, kind of the same. I wrote the first draft of that like the night after Halloween. That one I didn't quite know. I didn't set out to, you know, go from being a parent to my own childhood or whatever. It was more that there were all these images from the night before that I was like, I'm just going to, you know, start writing with those and see what happens. So
sort of just exploring the images that you recalled from the evening.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, incredibly evocative, and I really enjoyed the way that the themes, both of them are great pieces. I mean, I loved the compact and tender beauty of the first one. The second one, I mean, I definitely identified with as a parent who's taking their kids out on Halloween. But in both of them, I feel like the imagery and the attention to detail that you have, I mean, it suggests to me that you're really paying attention when things are happening of like, right, what sense data is coming in. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
You use they, them, non-binary pronouns, and I'm curious, how does gender or considerations of gender work itself into your writing, and or do you notice that it plays any role in terms of your involvement in writing communities or like the publishing writing kind of world?
Well, I've only like been officially like out, I guess, as non-binary for. I mean, I sort of like that. It wasn't like a big coming out. It was more just like I just started quietly like changing all my social media profiles and bios to they, them, and like for a while I was doing both they, them, and she, her, and then I was like, okay, let's just drop the she, her now. So as far as involvement in writing communities, I mean, I don't really feel like it's made any difference. I mean, the only thing is that, you know, people who always knew me as like going by, you know, still using she, her, like sometimes mess up, but, you know, which can be uncomfortable, you know, for everyone involved, but that's really the only, you know, the only issue that I've had, is when, like, or like when, actually that doesn't even bother me as much, as when, and this has only happened a few times, but it's like people will like put me in a list of their favorite like women writers or whatever, and that bothers me more than people calling me she. You know, like I don't know why. I mean, I guess part of it, I guess that might have bugged me even before like before being out as non-binary, just because I've always been one of those people that's like, why list women writers? Why not just writers? Or like, I mean, I get with like anything with like racial or gender or, you know, sexual minorities or whatever, it's to make up for the disparity in the, you know, just general lists. But at the same time, I feel like the answer isn't to further ghettoize people into like labels. Instead, it's to, you know, write more lists that include women and people of color and non-binary people and queer people, you know. So, that was a tangent. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, that's exactly sort of what, you know, these are things that I am thinking about, particularly as like you know, as an editor, as someone who's trying to be inclusive, right? But like, I just go by whatever pronoun I am appearing as to whoever's talking to me, right? And so like throughout my life, I've been identified as he, and at this point, like that's still it fits to me, right? Like, but I don't know that if somebody referred to me as they, that I would have any kind of issue with that. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, that's the other thing. Pronouns are actually not. I think the reason that I use they them professionally, I guess, is that pronouns. I mean, I don't necessarily, like I said, being put on like a list of women writers feels more like misgendering than
Sure.
being called, saying, oh, she, or even he.
Sure.
Like, I wouldn't actually, that wouldn't be, pronouns are not,
The centrality.
like, it's not that they're not important to me, but
sure.
they're not as,
right.
I don't know. They just don't, I guess the reason I mostly use they, them professionally is that, or like online and in my like writing stuff, is that it's a way to be legible as being non-binary. Like people now associate they them pronouns with non-binary identities. So
sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so I went off on my thing only to say, like, I don't identify as someone who is non-binary, right? But I have this sort of, like, understanding from my perspective of, like, being assigned male at birth. Like, this is how other people are identifying me. This pronoun makes sense. So I don't have a context for seeing either non-binary or gender non-conforming existence or identity from the inside, right? And that's kind of, I mean, I don't feel like you went on any sort of a tangent. It felt to me like, oh, okay, like this is helping me understand sort of like, right, the perspective. And I mean, I would agree with you in terms of the, right, these various lists. While I can understand like somebody wanting to put together a publication or a venue that exclusively highlights marginalized communities, I also think if you're not going to be doing that, like if you're not going to set your publication up as exclusively trying to promote these groups or writing that promotes those, right, like supports those groups actively, then like you ought to just like not, right, you ought to make a concerted effort to include as much diversity as there is within the writing community to reflect that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And but I know you would also ask, like, how does it inform my actual writing, or like, and that's an interesting thing, because I don't I rarely not rarely, I mean, I actually just wrote a whole long issue of my zine about like my process of discovering my gender identity, which also has to do with like sexual orientation, because for me at least they're like intrinsically tied together. I know that's not true for everyone, but that's just like my own internal experience.
Sure.
And I've written a couple poems about, but I generally don't write like about, it can get really like annoying. Like I don't want to write about just like gender stuff, because that's
sure.
But it informs my writing, I guess. But like a lot of times, I mean, I like writing because I don't have to, especially like a poem, I don't have to gender myself necessarily. I'm just writing either as like I, or so I feel like I can be just me without the necessary trappings of of what people perceive me as.
Yeah.
But it does get tricky when I'm writing about my past, because I don't know how to refer to myself. Like most of the times I just say, like, I was a girl, or, a young woman, because there's no real good term for like people say like, well, non-binary person is just too clunky. I mean, I'm never going to use that in a poem. Like,
Sure.
when I was a young non-binary person, and then some people shorten it to NB, which I just personally don't like. It
Sure.
feels really infantilizing in a way, like to me.
Sure.
I just, in a way that girl or boy doesn't. NB sounds, I don't know. It's not for me.
And do you mean the ENBY, or do you mean like the letters NB?
ENBY,
Okay.
yeah. I've seen it both ways, but I think people write it phonetically now a lot.
Yeah.
But it's hard to, because like I write about my past, and like if I'm writing either in the third person or, you know, describing myself, I'll say like girl or young woman or whatever, and that's not entirely correct, but neither would be saying boy, you know, and probably that would be less correct in terms of what people would then picture, you know. And like I said, there's no real good term. Like there's a friend of mine once put it as there's a dearth of terminology for non-binary people at this point.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and so much of that has to do with, like, I'm just assuming based that you and I roughly are in the same generation, right? That like prior to our kind of moving into parenthood, the world as I experienced it was very much designed for a binary gender system that, right, like programmed or attempted to program this sort of duality into the minds of everyone I knew, even whether or not they were identifying personally, right? Like the society, the parents, the teachers, sort of were all operating under the assumption, right? I think certainly that's been challenged and has changed for the better, right? But I can definitely understand why, if you're trying to paint a picture of who the individual is in a past that has that sort of historicity to it, that from a writerly perspective, right, the image that you want to evoke in the reader's mind is going to, right, sort of require using the terminology of the past in a way that makes sense and isn't like, I don't know, like maybe you don't want to use an omniscient narrator, or at least an omniscient narrator that's using this sort of the complexity of reference as like a part of the story, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's well, and like I said, I mean, when I was in my like late teens or early 20s, I, you know, started meeting more people who were all kind of like genderqueer and trans and stuff. But the thing is that genderqueer was a term then, but non-binary was not.
Sure.
And like no one was really talking about they them pronouns or anything. So and that's the other thing. Like when I describe myself in the past, like, I mean, obviously I usually go into more description than just a girl, because that's, you know,
sure.
that, but sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Happens to me all the time.
when I just am describing like who I was in the past, like I wouldn't have. Well, for one thing, I wouldn't have thought of myself as non-binary then, because I didn't even know the term. And for another thing, like non-binary is almost too nondescript. Like you have to have, you know, I mean, that's what I guess girl and boy are as well. Sure. But like they at least imply some kind of like gender thing. But if I say a non-binary person, that does not tell you if they're feminine, masculine, you know, it's, you know.
Yeah, I mean, certainly as a writer, you're going to get into the more granular particulars, not only of their appearance, but of their psychology and their, you know, general sort of orientation to the world and how they're relating to all of those other social factors. But just in terms of the singular reference, right, like, you know, this, what word are you going to use to refer to this person, right? I'm curious, so I'm looking at the time and I'm seeing that we're an hour in, and I've still got probably like another 15 to 20 minutes in me. I don't know what your schedule will allow for.
I can keep going.
Okay. Cool.
I can cut out one of the poems if need be.
Sure. Well, do you have one that you'd like to read now, or would you like me to move on to another question?
Well, yeah, you can go ahead and, well, it depends on what your next question is.
Sure.
Because I have one that I was going to read that I think goes into one of your later questions you had mentioned, but it also does have a little bit about like gender and stuff in there, like
Sure.
In a way that that actually I was really happy with, because I didn't feel like I made it about gender, but
Sure.
but it fit in with what I was.
And that, just to be clear, like that's sort of exactly what I was asking, is like, right, sort of with the understanding that like well, I don't know if this is necessarily true, but I assume that most writers do not want to be pigeonholed as a particular kind of writer, right? That like
right.
we have our identities, obviously, right? But that we each of us is more than any one of these identities, and in addition to being an intersection of a variety of identities, like we're just an individual, right, who is engaged in one of the intersections of being a writer. And
right.
We don't necessarily want our work to only be viewed through the lens of this, right, like of one of those particular identities. So this is sort of what I anticipated, was that gender would somehow work its way into your writing, though it wouldn't necessarily be like the overarching theme. I would say, why don't you go ahead and read that piece, and then I will try, though I think it will make sense to me, to identify what the other question topic would have been and maybe transition into that.
All right. So this poem is from my most recent chapbook, Left of the Dial, which came out last August, end of August, with Scumbag Press. And the overarching like concept of this chapbook was, for a brief time in the late 90s and early 2000s, I was a college radio DJ, and I had a lot of like stories from that time in my life, and so I wrote this chapbook all inspired by things that happened then, but also by songs that I know for a fact I played on air. So each poem takes its inspiration, well, usually from actually more than one song, but from one in particular. So this poem, the inspiration was the Dead Milkmen's Punk Rock Girl. And the poem's called Pretty and Punk Rock Girl. In the summer was the cedar, the swaying was the summer after high school, was the last summer of the 1990s. The summer I fell for punk rock girls, the slam dance summer, turning on to try and burn. Summer burning into fall, I fell for girls who could eat me alive with fudge banana swirl, pizza grease, and iced tea adventures, took us stealing CDs from shopping malls we laughed at all fall. Was the summer of my secrets, leaving notes on bumper stickered cars, leaving secrets about cities. The Philly of my shredded heart, where I left my Miss Washington, D.C., was a tale of 4 cities. She's my only true. Hey, suburbia, we're in love with Illinois. North to the core of Kenosha, to the college. I started college. It was still the 90s. Barely walked the halls and met a girl there. She almost bombshell knocked me drop dead. I was ducky, like the toaster said, pretty in punk, attitude, aesthetic. My aesthetic was fall, the trees burning on to try and turn. orange, yellow, red, burn, don't freeze, don't move. You've been chosen an extra daydream of a movie adaptation to the sequel of The Summer of My Aesthetic Secrets. I fell in love with people, not genders, except girls. My gender was angsty, nerd, love-struck misanthrope, sheltered boy daydreaming a rowdy, delinquent girlfriend to eat pizza with my asthmatic accordion heart. Was the fall I dropped out of the library, turned on to radio, where I directed my love, broadcast my secrets, spun my notes left on airwaves, lyriced my stream of consciousness, I summered fall. And the radio boys called me hip chick, asked, do you have a beau? I smiled, fell, well, no, it was only me and the punk rock girls. I could only hope were tuning in.
Wow. The asthmatic accordion heart, that really caught my ear in that piece. And I was catching a couple different references throughout, not just to music, but also to film that evoked memories for myself as well. Do you mind if I ask what college it was at that you were a radio DJ?
Parkside.
Oh, okay.
Well, I was there, and then I left Parkside and went to Northwestern for a brief time, and I was a DJ there as well. Then came back to Parkside, so the chapbook goes kind of chronologically like back and forth between
Okay.
Parkside and Northwestern.
Interesting the way the geography and cultural references might change. Yeah, I made a similar trip from Parkside to Columbia College and then the city colleges and then back to Parkside. So
see, I went Parkside, Northwestern, back to Parkside, Columbia College, then UW Milwaukee. So
okay, all right. You and I have very, very similar trajectories then.
Yeah, apparently.
You mentioned that this whole chapbook of poems really kind of focuses on the role that you're playing as a DJ and the music of the time that you're remembering having played through. I'm curious whether you found that music was working its way in, and you mentioned that you were a musician as well. So I'm curious how music has worked its way into your writing, maybe historically prior to this project, to explicitly, base a collection around it and aim to develop something that was like unified around the theme of music. Did you find that it was something that had been circulating itself into your writing prior to that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that like music is one of my biggest like inspirations and works its way into a lot of my stuff. This was the first time I'd ever explicitly like set out to, write not just one poem, but like, a short, collection around, specific songs. But like I said, even though each poem in there has one song that's like the overarching song, they all kind of reference more than one. And that was something that was happening in my poems, like has been, probably since maybe not since I started writing poetry, but definitely since my teen years.
I generally find among poets that, I should say poets in particular, that music tends to be, and the lyrics that we hear at a younger age tend to be part of the thing that draws us toward writing poems, or at least informs the way that we start writing poems, even if we don't become musicians or writers of song lyrics exclusively or necessarily. We're friends on social media. For all of the viewers out there, I am friends with Jessie on social media. you are fairly vocal as a human and as a writer about the role mental health plays in your life, and I'm curious whether you can kind of connect your experience with mental health and self-care with the act of writing, as well as like the kind of experiences that we have as writers and artists connected to the artistic practice. I mean, right, like I'm thinking particularly of like being out and like socializing places. It's like difficult for me personally, right? Attending to like the overwhelm of deadlines and that kind of thing. Like, how does mental health and the activity associated with writing and art play out for you?
Yeah, there's I mean, it can be tricky. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like finding that balance and like not, and also about like writing as addiction and how like, like I was saying that writing isn't necessarily actually bad for you unless you're like so into something that you're not eating, you're not sleeping, you're ignoring your other, and I think that writing, it's, I mean, any kind of art, obviously, like I know musicians and, painters and stuff can have the same issues, but I feel like writing especially is associated with addiction. Like, I feel like writers are almost encouraged to use substances, like, and that can be like a huge, like I remember when I went to Columbia College, I was in the fiction writing department, and back when you could still get away with it, like people would smoke in the stairwell between classes, and there were always more smokers from the fiction writing department than like any other department. And just, the sort of like lionizing, and I guess this goes into like romanticizing things versus, putting them in literature, but like, I'm not talking about writers like Kerouac or Burroughs or whatever who wrote about their experiences with drugs and alcohol. I mean the people who like lionize them and go like, oh, I want to be like Burroughs, I should shoot up, or, or not that they would say it like that, because that sounds, I don't know if anyone's ever actually like done it just for that reason. There's always something deeper going on. But like, just to sort of like glamorize, I guess, glamorize, that's the word I'm looking for.
Sure.
So like looking at like Dylan Thomas and like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway and just being like, oh yeah, they were great writers and they drank themselves to death. So I guess to be,
right.
I don't even know if it's conscious a lot of the time. Like people aren't going, well, if I want to be a great writer, I also have to be an alcoholic. It's more like, it's just kind of the sort of tacitly encouraged. Like,
sure. Or at the very least, it serves as a way to explain it away, right? So that you're like, oh, well, the reason why I drink like this, or the reason why I use these substances is because I am a writer. And so if I want to continue doing this, then of course I have to, right? Like,
or like the thing of, I guess, I mean, I don't want to stereotype that writers and a lot of artists tend to have mental health issues. So there's also the self-medication aspect, but then when everyone around you is like also doing those things and maybe encouraging you, like, again, I'm not saying peer pressure or like we won't hang out, with you if you don't drink, but they're not discouraging it either, you know?
Sure.
And that goes into the socializing aspect, like at events and stuff. I mean, yeah, I have to say that, like, it's not that I can't do an event with nothing to drink, and that's actually one of the things that, like, that's when I get scared, is like when I feel like I need a substance to get through something. But I definitely always way more anxious, like, if I'm stone cold sober. Like, and it's not even necessarily that, because I don't get plowed like I did when I was young, but it's not even that necessarily like having a beer is going to
Yeah.
really take away that anxiety, but it's something of like it's a crutch, right? Like just knowing you have that there is what,
Mm.
at least for me, like what,
Sure.
yeah, I don't know.
Well, and I would just step in. I would also say, so a couple things, right? Like, it makes sense to me that anybody who didn't drink like I drank and who was able to moderate their drinking would want to be able to like enjoy it and take the edge off in a celebratory way. So I'll say that up front. Like, I'm not trying to demonize anybody who
Oh no, yeah,
does, and I don't think you are either. Um, I also, it came to my mind just that, like, based on what you were saying, so much of the writing and arts culture features alcohol at various events. I mean, there's always wine when you have an open gallery night. So frequently at the poetry readings, there's either, I mean, every poetry reading or open mic I went to, there was, if it wasn't at a bar and it was just in a gallery or somebody's house, like, there was a box of wine or a jug of wine or bottles of wine that were
yeah,
floating about. So it's certainly part of the culture. Though I would freely acknowledge that some people just have no issue with it, and they can moderate their drinking and not become consciously or unconsciously abusive of it.
right,
But I think, to your point, right, the self-medication is kind of the issue that would come up for individuals who have other mental health struggles, right? Like, I mean, if you're using drugs or alcohol to like mask or cope with the masking, right?
right,
And also, I'd want to acknowledge too that, like, you'd mentioned previously, like, the harm reduction aspect. Like, sometimes, like, I can understand why, given the trauma that an individual has experienced, or given the additional mental health conditions that could come along with that or on their own, right? Just coping with the kind of society that we live in can necessitate choosing self-medication as a preferable, less harmful option, right? So I think that plays into what we're talking about as well.
yeah, absolutely. And for me, I guess it's that, like, because I used to, I'm lucky in that I've fairly been able to, you know, um, like keep my drinking to a point that it's not, unhealthy or anything, which,
Yeah,
like, I know I'm fortunate in that regard. And considering my history with it is not something I necessarily knew would be the case. And like drugs, I just had to stop. Like that was
yeah,
like not, and I by that I mean I'm not counting like you know like marijuana or anything as a drug. I mean I don't really partake in that anymore, but like I
sure,
mean like hard drugs.
sure, yeah,
Um, I had to just quit those. Like there was no like I can do a little bit, because with those
right,
for me doing a little bit goes back into full blown like
yeah, right.
that's my life now. So um but yeah, self-medicating, and I mean I mean yeah, the world we live in, and personal circumstances, it's I guess the balance for me, I guess what I'm trying to say is like trying to find that line between when it's self-medication and
Sure,
when I'm making things worse for myself,
sure,
like
sure.
get the dosage right, I guess would be
Do
the
you find that the state of your mental health, or like your mental emotional health, influences not just like what you're writing, but like how you're approaching writing, or whether you're approaching writing?
absolutely. Um, if I'm too depressed, I can't write. Like it's you know that's why that's another one of those like things about like people glorifying this sort of like tortured artist, and you know, not just the addiction, but also like glorifying the mental illness. And it's like, I'm paraphrasing, but I read something like once where Leonard Cohen had said like, no, I mean, you know, he was speaking specifically of depression, saying, I think sometimes you can write or, you know, make art in spite of the disorder, but if you're too far into it, you know, it completely shuts down creativity, and that's how I find it. I also, I'm bipolar, so I write more when I'm manic, but I don't necessarily see anything to completion. Like, I'll start a bunch of stuff and then have to go back and like finish things and edit heavily when I'm, you know, back on a more even keel. But when I'm lower than that, when I'm like fully depressed, I can't write at all. It just, I mean, nothing will happen.
Right. So who, this would be my last question before I just ask some particulars about where the audience can find more of your stuff. Who do you see as the main audience for your writing? Who are you writing for, and what do you hope that they get out of what they read from you?
Oh, that is such a hard question. I guess I'm writing for like, I mean, you know, not necessarily young misfits or people who once were young misfits, I guess, you know, not necessarily people who are still young, but like people, and I say misfit just because that can encompass a wide variety of kinds of, you know, people who were, you know, other, you know, gender nonconforming or, you know, artists or just like had, you know, quirky personalities or were into like subcultures in a way that wasn't encouraged or, you know, any kind of, I mean, I guess that would overall be what I'm, who I'm writing for. But there's probably more specifics in that. Anyone, I guess, who is like really nostalgic, because I am like probably the most nostalgic person ever. But
so when people finish listening to this episode and they want to find more of your stuff to read, or they want to get in contact with your press or find these works from the varieties of presses that have released your stuff, where can they go? How can they get a hold of you? How can they find more stuff to read by Jessie Lynn McMains?
Well, I have official websites for both myself and the press, but they're both under construction right now because I moved servers a while ago and have not had the time to run the update the websites yet. But I wish there was a way I could like show the text on the screen, because.
Sure, I'll write it down and try and get it in there.
Okay.
I probably won't cut this. I won't cut this audio or video out because it's too much work for me. But I'll put I'll put whatever you tell me right now on the bottom of the screen.
Okay, I'll just put it in the chat. Yeah, it's at Linktree I have one for both myself and for boneandinkpress. So.
Okay.
There we go. And those have links to both have, you know, they both have links to where you can buy either my stuff or stuff from the press, find newer publications, news, you know, all the social media and stuff. So, so and they have links to the official websites as well, but I suggest the Linktree right now, because if you go to the website, they'll just send you back to the Linktree because there's like nothing really there right now. So.
Sure. And we like to keep things efficient here on the Paper Knives podcast. for you, the viewer. That's why we're here. Thank you very much, Jessie Lynn McMains, for coming through and representing Racine, Wisconsin, and reading your work and having a great conversation. That honestly, I wish I had more time and we could keep going, because
Right, yeah.
I had like 3 to 5 follow-up questions for.
And I had 2 more poems, so.
Oh man, I feel really bad.
No, it's fine. I went on tangents and it was, yeah, so.
Well, I'll say this, if you want to record yourself reading them.
We had been talking a bit about the influence of music and other art on my writing, so I wanted to share this one more poem. It's specifically an ekphrastic from a piece of visual art, but it also references music and film. It's called Our Windows, Our America, and it's after Marc Chagall's America Windows. He had that electric sugar shock of dark hair, like the gravel-voiced man who sang my favorite sad songs, was haloed always by something like smoke rings and coffee steam, blurred headlights of passing cars, the moon's corona, a spray of tiny white moths appearing in a shock, then gone. He grew up outside Rockford, the first of my Illinois boys who shared the same first name. I met him halfway the 1st of June, laughing, "Here, I made you a mixtape, my favorite music." We met as friends. I was already taken. How indiscreet, my. That night, he took pictures of me, smoke-wreathed over coffee by the window glass, blurred beneath the bare-bulb glare in the Howard Johnson's basement. It was the first time I'd ever felt like someone, a subject worthy of a photograph. I knew I'd fall like falling off a skateboard, rolling down the hill by the oasis over Interstate 90. Inevitable as skinned knees, grass stains, a busted lip, I cough and I choke. In the parking lot, we found a child's lost craft project. Construction paper stars, strung on blue yarn, sun-faded but still intact. A bouquet of stars. Years on, I worked for a season in a flower shop, a job the second boy with the same first name helped me find. It was Christmas time. I arranged bouquets. Precious thyme rose red, dendrobium orchid white with yellow starred center, evergreen of spruce boughs. After work, I'd head north to the Art Institute, stand again in front of Chagall's America Windows. The warm blue light, all the people dancing, making music, violins. The moon, the swirl, menorah candles, purple bird. Yellow-green spray of flowers floating above the blue buildings. I'd remember him, how if I could make our windows, our America, they'd have the broken bottle glass, drought-dry grass, blur of headlights, sun-warmed suburban aqueducts, skateboards, skinned knees, swirl of smoke, coffee steam, glacier-carved lakes, blue dark, icy shock, mixtapes, tiny cities, the halfway places where we met, the moths. 2 people dancing on the flowered tiles of a filmic kitchen, so happy together. The rain we got caught in, the blue taste of the rain which stained his skin, a faded bouquet of construction paper stars, these letters asking why I was made the desperate way I am.
And send them to me. I'll work them in.
Okay. All right.
Unless one or more of them was going to be something that you were going to send me for the video magazine. I mean, you could hold on to one of them, but if you've got 3, and you know what I mean, if one of them was already earmarked for that, and you've got these 2, send them my way, and I'll.
I only have 2. I could record one for the magazine and one for this.
Okay. Yeah, that would be awesome. If you didn't mind sending them to me, I'll work one more in before the last question. And obviously, I'll keep this awkward dialogue in there so that
all right.
So that we're really authentic. That's
yes.
what I strive for here is minimal cuts. Look at my furnace. Thanks a lot, Jessie. I appreciate it.
Thank you.